In the early morning of June 23, 1944, the headquarters of Army Group Center occupied a network of reinforced bunkers and administrative buildings near Minsk that had been accumulating the paperwork of 3 years of occupation governance alongside the operational documents of a front line stretching nearly 900 kilometers from the Pripyat marshes to the upper reaches of the Dvina River. The officers who slept in those buildings and the clerks who processed their communications had spent the previous weeks managing a steady flow of intelligence reports that described Soviet troop concentrations, rail movements, and logistical buildups along multiple sectors of the front. The reports were read, they were filed, they were forwarded through the appropriate channels to Oberkommando des Heeres at Rostenburg, where they arrived as components of a broader intelligence picture that the German Army's analytical apparatus assessed as indicating a probable Soviet offensive in the southern Ukraine, near Kovel, or possibly against Army Group North in the Baltic sector. The possibility that the Soviets were preparing to strike Army Group Center with the full weight of 4 coordinated fronts using a combined arms force whose total strength exceeded 1.2 million men, supported by 4,000 tanks and 24,000 artillery pieces, was categorized as a secondary contingency rather than the primary operational threat. That assessment was not a product of analytical incompetence, it was the conclusion of an intelligence system that had evaluated Soviet operational capacity against the template of Soviet performance in 1941 and 1942, and found that the mathematics of the undertaking exceeded what that system believed Soviet industrial and organizational capability could sustain. The assessment was wrong in the specific way that strategic miscalculations are always wrong when the measuring instrument has not been recalibrated to account for the subject's fundamental transformation. Field Marshal Ernst Busch commanded Army Group Center from that headquarters complex with a temperament that his subordinate commanders described in their private correspondence as characterized by an excessive deference to Hitler's standing order that classified every position on the Eastern Front as a designated fortified place to be held without withdrawal, regardless of tactical circumstances. Busch had not created that order, and his personal military judgment, formed across 3 years of Eastern Front experience, likely recognized its operational absurdity in the specific geographic conditions Army Group Center occupied in the summer of 1944. The front line his forces held was a salient bulging eastward into Soviet-controlled territory, its flanks exposed, its supply lines dependent on rail connections that Soviet partisan activity had been systematically degrading for 18 months, its defensive positions organized around a series of towns that Hitler had designated as fortified places, requiring garrison forces that could not be used to create tactical reserves. Army Group Center held its 600,000 men in a linear defensive posture that consumed available strength in forward positions while leaving almost nothing in depth to respond to penetrations. The Soviet operational planners who had spent the preceding months studying those dispositions through aerial reconnaissance, partisan intelligence networks, and prisoner interrogation had identified the structural weakness with a clarity that Army Group Center's own staff assessments consistently failed to generate because the German analytical framework was not organized to interrogate the adequacy of its own positional doctrine. The artillery preparation that opened Operation Bagration at 5 o'clock on the morning of June 23 delivered what forward German observers described as a physical transformation of the landscape. The Soviet fire plan concentrated approximately 170 artillery pieces per kilometer of breakthrough sector, a density that exceeded anything the German army had faced since the industrial mobilization of Soviet war production reached full operational expression in the winter of 1942. The specific ballistic arithmetic of that preparation requires examination to understand why the front line did not bend under it and eventually recover, as German tactical doctrine had historically permitted, but instead ceased to exist as a coherent defensive structure within the first 72 hours of the offensive. A 170-gun density per kilometer, firing preparatory concentrations across a 40-minute window before infantry assault, delivered in excess of 300 tons of steel and explosive per linear kilometer of defended frontage. German defensive positions that had been constructed over months using organization-taught labor and the compulsory work of Soviet civilians were not damaged by that concentration. They were reduced to the geological condition of the earth they had been built upon, with the distinction between constructed defensive works and unmodified terrain eliminated as a practical military category. The soldiers who survived the preparation in forward positions did so in the specific statistical category of men who happened to occupy the precise cubic volume of space that a particular shell did not occupy at the moment of detonation, and they emerged from bunkers that still stood into a tactical environment in which the coordinated defensive response their training prescribed was no longer executable because the communications infrastructure, the crew-served weapons, and the unit cohesion required to execute it had been destroyed around them. The Soviet ground forces that advanced behind that preparation moved according to a doctrine that the Red Army had developed through the systematic analysis of German operational methods applied against Soviet forces in 1941 and 1942, extracted from those disasters the underlying principles of combined arms penetration, and then refined those principles through 2 years of increasingly sophisticated offensive operations that culminated in the winter campaigns of 1943 and 1944. The tank armies committed to Bagration were not the instrument that had been destroyed in the summer of 1941, rebuilt on improvised principles and committed piecemeal to defensive fighting around Moscow and Stalingrad. They were organizations that had absorbed the complete operational logic of armored warfare as Germany had developed it, augmented it with Soviet modifications appropriate to the specific conditions of the Eastern Front, and then equipped it with a material base that the Lend-Lease program and Soviet domestic production had jointly brought to a quantitative level that changed the fundamental arithmetic of the engagement. The T-34 tank that formed the primary armored component of those formations had been produced at the rate of approximately 1,200 units per month by the Ural and Siberian factories that Soviet industrial evacuation had moved beyond German bombing range in the desperate autumn of 1941. By June 1944, those factories had been producing T-34s in that quantity for over 2 years, accumulating an armored mass that the German tank production system, consuming aluminum and steel allocations competed for by submarine construction, aircraft manufacture, and rocket programs, could not match in aggregate terms, regardless of the individual technical superiority that the Panther and Tiger designs represented at the platform level. The kinetic reality of the first 48 hours on the Army Group Center front registered in the situation maps at Bush's headquarters as a pattern of penetrations that the available reserve forces could not seal because those reserves did not exist in the depth and concentration required to address simultaneous breakthrough operations across 4 separate sectors. The fortified places that Hitler's standing order had designated as defensive anchors became instead the mechanism of the front's dissolution, because the divisions assigned to garrison them could not withdraw to form mobile reserves without violating a command directive that carried consequences for the officer who issued the withdrawal order that were not merely professional but judicial. Commanders who understood that their positions were being bypassed and encircled filed requests for freedom of movement that arrived at Army Group Center, proceeded to OKH, and returned as denials, while the Soviet armored columns that had bypassed those fortified places were already operating in the operational depth that German doctrine had assumed would be available for reserve employment. The Ninth Army, under General Hans Jordan, occupied the southern shoulder of the Army Group Center salient with a force whose nominal order of battle bore diminishing relationship to the actual combat strength available to defend the positions assigned to it. Jordan's divisions carried numerical designations that implied organizations of 10,000 men equipped with the full complement of artillery, anti-tank weapons, and supporting arms that the Wehrmacht's table of organization prescribed. The reality, encoded in the classified strength returns that Jordan's staff compiled weekly, was a consistent and worsening divergence from those nominal figures that the German army's replacement system had been unable to close since the winter fighting of 1943. The 45th Infantry Division, holding a sector west of Bobroysk that the Soviet operational plan had identified as a primary breakthrough point, reported an effective fighting strength of approximately 4,200 men in June 1944, representing less than 45% of establishment strength, with artillery complement at 60% of authorized levels and anti-tank assets at 53%. Those numbers were not exceptional within the Army Group Center context. They were representative of the systemic depletion that had been consuming German combat power on the Eastern Front since Stalingrad, at a rate that the replacement system flowing from training depots inside Germany could not match because the depots themselves were drawing on a manpower pool that 4 years of attrition warfare had reduced to age classes and physical categories that would have been classified as unfit for frontline service in 1941. The Soviet 65th Army struck the 45th Infantry Division's sector at 0500 hours on June 24th, behind an artillery preparation that Jordan's forward observers reported as the most intense they had observed in 3 years of Eastern Front service. The observation was not rhetorical. The Soviet fire plan for the Bobroysk axis allocated 356 guns and mortars per kilometer of breakthrough sector, a concentration that exceeded the preparatory fires at Kursk in the previous summer and represented the operational expression of a Soviet artillery production program that had been delivering in excess of 120,000 artillery pieces and mortars annually since 1942. The 45th Division's forward positions did not hold for the time that Jordan's defensive plan required them to hold for reserves to respond. They held for approximately 90 minutes of ground assault following the artillery preparation, a duration that the divisional commander, General Lieutenant Gerhard Engel, reported as consistent with the maximum defensive capacity of units at his available strength against assault formations of the size and armored support density that the Soviet 65th Army committed to the initial penetration. Engel's after-action assessment, composed under circumstances that made extended analytical reflection unlikely, was nonetheless precise on the essential point. The defensive line had not failed because of a tactical error or a local command decision. It had failed because the ratio between the force attacking it and the force defending it exceeded the threshold at which tactical skill, prepared positions, and individual unit quality could compensate for the arithmetic deficit. The armor that exploited the 9th Army penetration belonged to the 1st Guards Tank Corps, a formation that had been rebuilt and re-equipped following the Kursk fighting, with a thoroughness that reflected the Soviet system's capacity to regenerate armored strength at rates the German Army's intelligence assessments had systematically underestimated through 1943. The 1st Guards Tank Corps committed to the Bobruisk exploitation with a strength of approximately 340 operational tanks and self-propelled guns, a figure that represented full establishment strength within the margins that Soviet logistics officers considered acceptable for a formation entering a major offensive operation. The tanks were T-34 Model 1943 variants with the F-34 76mm gun and a hull armor configuration that had been thickened in response to the lessons of the summer 1943 fighting, supported by Su-85 self-propelled guns, whose 85mm main armament could defeat the frontal armor of the Panzer IV at operational combat ranges. The combination was not technically superior to the German armor it would engage in the exploitation phase. The Panther that Germany had deployed in response to the T-34's appearance retained a ballistic advantage at extended ranges that German tank commanders understood and attempted to exploit. What the 1st Guards Tank Corps possessed that the German armored formations opposing it did not was a 340 tank strength against an available German armored reserve in the 9th Army sector that totaled fewer than 90 operational vehicles. A ratio that rendered the Panthers' individual technical advantage a tactical footnote in an engagement determined by industrial mathematics rather than ballistic specifications. The encirclement of Bobruisk was complete by June 27, 4 days after the offensive began, trapping approximately 70,000 German soldiers of the 9th Army in a pocket that the available relief forces could not reach because those forces did not exist in the strength required, and the Soviet armored columns that had created the encirclement were already driving westward toward Minsk rather than maintaining a static defensive perimeter that a relief operation could have addressed. The officers trapped in the Bobruisk pocket included 2 full corps headquarters whose staff officers had spent the preceding weeks preparing defensive plans for a front line that no longer existed, and whose communications with Army Group Center were conducted across radio frequencies that Soviet direction-finding assets had been monitoring and locating since the first hours of the offensive. Each transmission from the pocket allowed Soviet artillery to refine its targeting. The operational communications infrastructure that the trapped forces depended on for coordination was simultaneously the mechanism of their destruction, a ballistic anomaly in the precise sense that the instrument of command became indistinguishable from the instrument of targeting. Bush reported the developing situation to OKH with a fidelity that his chief of staff, General Hans Krebs, later described as comprehensive and accurate, meaning that the catastrophic scale of the front's collapse was documented in the situation reports flowing to Rastenburg with sufficient specificity that no analytical failure could account for a failure to comprehend it at the command level. Hitler's response to those reports followed the pattern that had characterized his engagement with Eastern Front crises since Stalingrad, an insistence on holding positions that had already been lost operationally, a commitment of forces to relief operations whose available strength bore no relationship to the combat power required to execute them, and a sequence of command changes that replaced commanders who accurately reported deteriorating situations with commanders who had not yet established the record of accurate reporting that made them targets for relief. Bush was replaced by Field Marshal Walter Model on June 28, 5 days into the offensive, at a moment when the front that Model was being asked to stabilize had already ceased to exist across a 200-kilometer frontage, and the Soviet armored spearheads were operating in the operational depth behind what had been Army Group Center's main defensive line with a freedom of movement that no available German force could constrain. The industrial audit of why those Soviet armored spearheads possessed that freedom requires examination of production figures that German strategic planning had treated as ceiling values rather than thresholds subject to continuous upward revision. The Soviet tank production program that supplied the formations executing Operation Bagration had delivered in excess of 15,000 tanks and self-propelled guns in 1943, a figure that exceeded German tank production in the same period by a ratio of approximately 2.4 to 1. That ratio understates the actual operational disparity because it excludes the Lend-Lease contribution of approximately 5,000 American and British armored vehicles delivered to Soviet forces in 1943 through the Persian Corridor and Arctic convoy routes, vehicles that freed Soviet domestic production capacity for the heavier and more tactically significant types that formed the core of the tank army offensive formations. The Americans were delivering Studebaker trucks through Lend-Lease at a rate that motorized the Soviet logistics system at precisely the moment when Soviet armored doctrine required mobile supply chains capable of sustaining deep exploitation operations at rates of advance that horse-drawn transport could not support. 47,000 Studebaker trucks reached Soviet forces by June 1944, and those trucks carried the fuel, ammunition, and replacement parts that kept the 1st Guards Tank Corps and the formations advancing alongside it moving at rates that exceeded the speed of German command decision-making. The Soviet spearheads were not outrunning their logistics. They were running on a logistical system that American industrial output had built for them. And that system was the invisible operational advantage that made the geographic depth of the German collapse possible. The strategic audit of Army Group Center's destruction that OKH's operations staff attempted to conduct in the final days of June 1944 was complicated by the fundamental methodological problem that the subject of the audit was still in the process of being destroyed while the analysis was being conducted. The situation maps at Rastenburg that had shown a coherent front line on June 22nd were updated daily with notations that progressively replaced unit symbols with question marks, then with encirclement indicators, then with the administrative designation that the German Army used to indicate formations whose locations were unknown because communications had ceased and no reliable report of their status had been received from any source considered credible. By July 3rd, the question marks and encirclement indicators covered a frontage that had previously been held by 3 full armies. The Army Group Center that had existed as an operational command on June 22nd had effectively ceased to function as a coordinated military entity. What remained was a collection of fragments, some of them fighting coherent rearguard actions, some of them attempting to break westward through Soviet encirclement rings, some of them in the specific category of units that had been so thoroughly disrupted by the initial assault that their senior officers no longer possessed reliable information about the location or combat status of their own subordinate formations. The city of Minsk fell on July 3rd, 9 days after the offensive began, to the armored formations of the 2nd and 3rd Belarusian fronts that had converged on the city from northeast and southeast in a double envelopment that Army Group Center's available mobile reserves had possessed neither the strength nor the operational freedom to contest. The fall of Minsk was not in itself the decisive event of the operation, because the decisive events had already occurred in the first 72 hours, when the front line was penetrated simultaneously at 4 points, separated by distances that precluded any mutual reinforcement between the threatened sectors. Minsk was the administrative consequence of those penetrations, the moment at which the geographic depth of the collapse became legible on a map at a scale that command-level decision-making could process, because Minsk was a named city with pre-war significance rather than a numbered grid coordinate on a military situation map. East of Minsk, in the forests and marshes through which the broken remnants of multiple German corps were attempting to move westward, the human cost of the front's collapse was expressing itself at a scale that the available accounting mechanisms could not fully capture in real time. Approximately 350,000 German soldiers were killed, captured, or reported missing in the initial 3 weeks of Operation Bagration, a casualty figure that represented the largest single defeat suffered by the German army in the Second World War, exceeding Stalingrad in total personnel losses and exceeding it further in the destruction of equipment, organizational structure, and the accumulated command experience that had been resident in Army Group Center's senior leadership since the opening of Barbarossa. The distinction between killed and captured in those figures requires the same forensic attention applied to the production numbers that preceded them, because it illuminates the specific character of the collapse in ways that aggregate casualty totals obscure. Approximately 150,000 of those men entered Soviet captivity, a proportion that reflects the encirclement dynamic of the operation rather than the frontal attrition dynamic of earlier Eastern Front fighting. Men who were captured had typically been bypassed by the Soviet exploitation phase, had found their formations disintegrated around them by the initial assault, or had attempted breakout operations from pocket positions and been overtaken by Soviet forces operating faster than the breakout could proceed. They were not men who had surrendered to superior force in a conventional tactical sense. They were men who had been removed from the operational equation by a Soviet command system that prioritized encirclement and exploitation depth over the systematic reduction of each pocket, leaving the trapped forces to disintegrate under supply exhaustion and artillery fire while the armored spearheads drove on to the next operational objective. Modal's assumption of command of Army Group Center on June 28 represented the German command system's standard response to a catastrophic command failure, which was to replace the commander and assign the crisis to an officer whose personal reputation for competence created the institutional impression that something material had been changed in the situation. Modal was a genuinely capable operational commander whose record on the Eastern Front included several instances of successfully stabilizing deteriorating situations through aggressive use of minimal available reserves and a willingness to accept tactical risk in secondary sectors to generate combat power for decisive points. Those capabilities were real and had been demonstrated under conditions that validated them as genuine rather than manufactured reputation. They were, in the specific operational context of July 1944 Army Group Center, insufficient to the requirement, not because Modal lacked the skill to employ them, but because the requirement exceeded the available means by a margin that no individual command capability could close. He was being asked to stabilize a front with formations that did not exist against an offensive that was continuing to generate momentum from a logistical base that had been built to sustain operations at this tempo for weeks rather than days. The strategic audit of his tenure in that command is therefore not a judgment of his tactical competence, but an examination of the gap between the task assigned and the resources provided, a gap that had its origins not in July 1944, but in the industrial decisions and manpower allocations of 1942 and 1943 that had determined how much combat power the German Army could put into Army Group Center sector in the summer of the following year. The Lend-Lease contribution to the operational infrastructure supporting Bagration extended into categories that post-war analysis has occasionally minimized in favor of the more dramatic tank and aircraft numbers, but whose operational significance was as decisive as any weapon system in determining the pace and depth of the Soviet exploitation. The field telephone wire that connected Soviet forward command posts to artillery fire direction centers during the assault phase was American manufactured. The canned rations that sustained the infantry divisions advancing on foot across terrain that vehicle logistics could not reliably reach were produced in Chicago and Kansas City. The aluminum that went into Soviet aircraft engine blocks came in significant measure from Reynolds Metals and Alcoa production facilities in the American South, whose annual output exceeded total German aluminum production by a ratio that the Luftwaffe's planners had stopped publishing in internal documents because the figures served no analytical purpose beyond documenting a deficit that no projected German production increase could address. The logistical lung of the Soviet summer offensive was not located in the Urals or Siberia alone. It extended across the Atlantic and through Persian Gulf ports and Arctic convoy routes to the factory floors of a nation that had decided the outcome of the Eastern Front was a problem within the scope of American industrial management, and had applied the same organizational methodology to solving it that had built the automobile industry and the electrical grid and the continental railroad system. The German army that had crossed the Soviet frontier on June 22, 1941, had done so with a genuine and not entirely unjustified confidence in the operational superiority of its command system, its tactical doctrine, and the accumulated experience of its officer corps. That confidence had a legitimate empirical basis in the operational record of 1939 and 1940, when German combined arms doctrine had demonstrated a consistent capacity to achieve results that exceeded what the nominal force ratios involved should have permitted. The delayed realization embedded in the catastrophe of June 1944 was not that German operational doctrine had been wrong in its own terms.
It was that the terms in which it was conceived,
terms defined by the operational timeframes and force ratios of European campaigns lasting weeks against opponents whose industrial base was either inferior or inaccessible, had no valid application to a conflict whose duration and scale had allowed the opposing industrial system to close every qualitative gap and then accumulate quantitative advantages that made the qualitative comparisons operationally irrelevant. A Panther tank with a ballistic advantage over a T-34 at 800 meters is a tactical asset in an engagement where the force ratios permit it to occupy the defensive position from which that advantage can be exploited. It is a rounding error in an operation where the formation it belongs to is being bypassed by 340 tanks moving at 30 kilometers per day through terrain its own command structure no longer controls. Army Group Center ceased to exist as a coherent military formation in the last week of June 1944, not because its soldiers failed to fight, and not because its commanders failed to exercise the operational skills their training and experience had produced. It ceased to exist because the industrial systems of the United States and the Soviet Union had spent 3 years building the material preconditions for its destruction, and those preconditions had been fully assembled and positioned before the first Soviet artillery round was fired on June 23rd. The 259,000 square kilometers of Soviet territory liberated in the first month of Bagration had been paid for in factories in Chelyabinsk and Detroit and Wichita and Magnitogorsk, in aluminum smelters and steel mills and ordnance plants and food processing facilities whose aggregate output had made the operational mathematics of the summer of 1944 a problem with only one possible solution. The German army encountered that solution on a front 900 kilometers wide and experienced it as military defeat. What it had actually encountered was the verdict of an industrial competition that had been decided before the tanks crossed the line of departure, rendered in the currency of destroyed divisions and abandoned positions and the 350,000 men who would not return from the forests east of Minsk.